So welcome everyone to the third webinar of our three-part series, The Environmental Injustice of Beauty, hosted by the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, the ENRICH Project. So to begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I am currently sitting on as I speak to you from Windsor, Ontario. This was the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people of the Three Fires Confederacy, which consists of the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the Odawa. Everyone is encouraged to reflect on the city that they're joining from, as we're joining from all over today. And if English isn't your first language, you can closed caption our conversation into your language of choice. So the ENRICH Project was established by Dr. Ingrid Waldron in 2012 to address the social, environmental, political, and health impacts of environmental racism in Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities. In 2020, the ENRICH Project became a project on Makeway's shared platform and expanded its scope to examine and address both environmental racism and climate change impacts in Indigenous, Black, and other marginalized communities across Canada. In fall 2022, we launched the social media campaign, The Environmental Injustice of Beauty, which aimed to build awareness about the adverse health effects of toxic personal care and beauty products. These webinars aim to expand on this campaign through bringing researchers, health professionals, activists, and community members together in conversation about the adverse health effects of toxic personal care and beauty products in this three-part series. So in today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the role of lax industry regulations in contributing to toxic exposures and how individuals can advocate for legislative change. We're going to hear from Marion Diamond from University of Toronto, Cassie Barker from Environmental Defense, and Muhannad Malas. So my name is Josie Alicia, and I'm going to be your moderator. I'm a social media influencer and content creator primarily on Instagram and an instructor at St. Clair College. I was introduced by the to the ENRICH Project by a friend, and I was very intrigued by the topics that they were investigating. I went on to collaborate with them as an influencer to help amplify their message of the Toxic Beauty campaign on social media. So I created a lot of content on Instagram and TikTok that incorporated trending memes and dances and audios as a way to captivate a younger audience and essentially get young women thinking about the long-term effects of the products that they use and put in their bodies. So now we're going to hear from our speakers. Let's start with Marion Diamond. Can you tell me a bit about yourself and why this topic is important to you?
Thank you very much, Josie, for the introduction. I should say first that I'm a professor at University of Toronto. I'm in Earth Sciences and School of the Environment. My research involves looking at chemical contaminants from their sources, for example, products, to how we are exposed and how the ecosystem is exposed. And I do this research through sampling, chemical analysis, mathematical modeling, interpretation of the data, but I've also been very involved in chemicals management. I'm the former co-chair of Canada's Chemical Management Plan Science Committee. I'm the former co-chair of Ontario Toxic Reduction Science Committee that brought in the Toxics Reduction Act that has since been repealed. I'm also, and right now I'm a member of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel to the Global Environment Facility, which is the financial instrument that enables low-income countries to work towards goals for climate change, chemicals such as mercury, persistent organic pollutants. So I'm very involved in chemicals management as well as the science of chemicals. Josie, do you want me to continue or do you want to ask a question?
No, go ahead. This is all super interesting. I don't have much of a background in chemicals, science, math. But if you feel that there's more as to why this topic is so important to you, I'd love to hear it.
So this project's important to me because we've been investigating exposures in the Canadian and other populations to hazardous chemicals. The literature speaks to widespread low-level effects, such as those consistent with behavior changes, everything from ADHD-like behavior to autistic spectrum disorder, sort of acting out and just difficult behaviors, increase in type 2 diabetes, reproductive effects. For example, there's been very solid documentation of decrease in sperm counts in men, and other reproductive effects. There have been increases in certain cancers, particularly in young people, such as thyroid cancer in young women and testicular cancer in young men. And there's also been issues related to immune dysfunction, such as autoimmune disease and lipid metabolism that can be manifest through increase in type 2 diabetes and also increased body mass index. And increased body mass index is unfortunately for individuals with very high body mass index is unfortunately associated with a very wide range of adverse effects. Well, these health effects can, a bunch of them can be traced to chemicals to which we're exposed. Everything from forever chemicals like PFAS to plasticizers, PFAS stands for per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, which we're exposed to in such a wide array of products. For example, we've recently published on PFAS in Canadian cosmetics. We will be publishing shortly on PFAS in Canadian fast food wrappers and containers, packaging. And we've published on PFAS in kids' uniforms and other children's products. We've also, these adverse chemical effects that I've mentioned are associated with, for example, phthalate plasticizers, and we've documented the levels to which we're exposed and also sources, which are particularly high in low socioeconomic income families. And we've also looked at other chemicals. So why am I concerned? I'm concerned because of the occurrence of widespread adverse health effects, which are consistent. They're not the only cause, but they're consistent with exposure to a range of chemicals. Our chemicals management plan tries to do a good job. It's really a very overwhelming and difficult job, but we're short on data for vulnerable populations. We have very few data in Canada, very few, if any data, very few data in Canada on marginalized, racialized groups of individuals. We have very few data on other vulnerable populations that are adversely affected, such as First Nations. We unfortunately do have data on many people in Inuit in the north because of long-standing elevated, higher exposures to a whole bunch of chemicals. That's mostly through diet. So there are loopholes in the chemicals management plan system that people like Muhannad and Cassie work towards filling those gaps. And more broadly, there are challenges that lie beyond Canada. Because I mean, Canada has a regulatory regime that really does need to be improved. And I don't just mean labeling, because I don't see labeling products as an equitable solution. Not everybody reads product labels. Not everybody can read labels. Lower socioeconomic income families often get hand-me-downs that don't have labels. So we need a more comprehensive and equitable solution to keep Canadians safe. And I'll end there, unless you have more questions.
No, that's a fantastic answer. Um, I think, yeah, we should take a lot of the onus off the consumer and just put it back onto the manufacturers. Because again, like you're saying, we're not always in control of the products that we receive. And then so we want to make sure that these products are healthy for us. So no, thank you so much for that. Um, Muhannad, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and your work with Ecojustice, which I am so sorry, I totally forgot to mention, and also why this topic is so important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Muhannad Malas, the Director of Law Reform at Ecojustice. I'm grateful to be living in so-called Hamilton, but it's on the traditional territories of many First Nations, including the Erie Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. And what I do at Ecojustice, well, maybe I'll just give a little bit of in few words, what Ecojustice is and what Ecojustice does. So Ecojustice is an environmental law charity. So we focus on using the law to protect people and the environment from environmental harm. So whether that's tackling climate change or halting and reversing biodiversity laws, or the topic of today's conversation, which is protecting people and the environment from exposure to toxic chemicals. You may sometimes find us, in the news, taking the government to court to ensure that they are, that the Minister of Environment or Minister of Health in a province or in Ottawa federally is enforcing our laws. But also what I do specifically is I work with an incredible team of people who work on law reform. So what that means is, we work to push government through lobbying, through coalition building, and research and analysis to improve laws and introduce new laws that we don't have, that would enable the kind of protections that we need to see from toxic chemicals or to address climate change and nature destruction and loss. Before Ecojustice, I was at Environmental Defense, where I was a toxic campaigner for several years. And then I also did some climate campaigning work at Stand.Earth, focusing on the fashion sector and the pollution of the fashion industry. And really the thread that kind of brings all of these pieces together in terms of what I do and why I care about this issue is because for me, the issue of the environment and public health has always been about equity and about justice. And I remember, in school at a very young age, I remember thinking about how with toxic chemicals, there wasn't, this issue is the kind of issue was very clear that, big companies, chemical industry, cosmetics industry is profiting off of poisoning people's bodies, and that, poison isn't impacting all of us in the same way or an equal way. There are some people who are impacted more than others, including racialized communities, Indigenous peoples, workers from marginalized, backgrounds, and that's really what drove me to kind of really focus on this issue and advocate for change. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I 100% agree with you. While there are toxins in all sorts of different products, we aren't all impacted in the same way. We don't all use creams every day. We don't all use hair products every day. We might not all shave our faces every single day, right? So it is interesting when we start to break down the kinds of people who are the most impacted by these toxins that are just lurking in these day-to-day products. I commend your work 100%. Very interesting. Cassie, I'd love to hear from you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and why this topic is important to you?
For sure. And I am joining from so-called Toronto. This is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and that's where I'm lucky to be calling in from. And environmental defense, we work on clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. we generally are using research and the media to push governments and industry to clean up their act. And the reason why I care about this so much is, I really think a lot about being a parent and having a kid, and thinking about, the world that they grew up in, the burden of toxics that they're born into, a lot of the impacts that Marion was talking about, and all of these unknowns, what their environmental exposures will result in, the kind of impacts on their cognitive, reproductive, all these systems that these exposures can impact, and how all of these intersecting factors of where you get to live, the kind of work that your parents get to do, the types of food, soils, and all of the things that can impact a person's health and their kids' health, which is something that is for any parent, just you don't want them to be starting off from a place where all of these exposures, all of these issues are pre-baked, and then you add in the aspects that you were talking about in terms of how the gendered nature of exposures, the racist, rules around hair and skin that, might lead to people having to use more products, having to fit a certain standard of beauty. And I think that, and that really gets into the core of today, and why we all are working, and why we all care so much about changing the system, as opposed to having individuals who are already dealing with multiple burdens, that this toxic burden shouldn't be another one of them. So I think that this is, someone who grew up in a really toxic part of the country, I think that this is, something that's near and dear to my heart, but it's also something that we need to address, these disproportionate impacts that are occurring, because your income or your address shouldn't determine how healthy you get to be. So I'm really glad that we get to talk about this today and what we can do to change the system.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know in a bit of our preamble there that not all of you participants got to listen in on, we were talking about taking the onus off of the consumer when it comes to hair care products. I was talking about my hair and how I like to wear my hair, and part of the issue is that in the products that are available to us in the store, there are all sorts of chemicals and toxins. They're just lurking there. And as consumers, we don't always know. We're not always reading the label, so you just buy things, and you're poisoning yourself. You don't even know you're poisoning yourself, but you're poisoning yourself. And so we have to, instead of blaming a consumer because, maybe we're not aware, we don't have the money, we don't have the knowledge, we need to have the government be more responsible and start to take more responsibility for our health. So we'll get into our next round of questions here. We'll start off with Miriam. What are some things that folks may not know about how chemicals and toxins and products are managed in Canada? And what impacts does this have on our daily exposure to hazardous chemicals?
Thanks, Josie. I just wanted to add, I agree that the government needs to take responsibility, but industry needs to take a lot more responsibility. They're very complicated supply chains, right? Let me just say why I believe that. We entrust the government for health and safety. It's a big responsibility. There are very many aspects. There are too many aspects, because there's also a lot of pushback not to want to pay more taxes, to have a larger civil service and hire more people to provide the oversight. Fundamentally, it needs to be a matter of private sector responsibility to be marketing products that allow for long-term, either the products are innocuous or provide some sort of benefit. So I believe strongly in private sector responsibility, and some of the most responsive entities amongst the private sector are retailers who interface between consumers and manufacturers who've been at the forefront of removing certain some problematic chemicals. So that's a response to your comment, Josie. So what's something that we may not know? It's hard, and I'm not a government apologist, but I will say it's incredibly difficult to be, sorry, let me start back at the beginning. So the way we manage chemicals in Canada is that we have both producers and manufacturers register chemicals according to how much of the chemical is used. But we don't have a lot of chemical producers, and the chemicals that we produce in Canada tend to be pretty simple. They're like polypropylene, polyethylene, we make those vials that our pills come in. We make some very simple plastic packaging. We don't produce a whole lot. What we do is import a whole lot of goods, finished goods, final products. I mean, when was the last, I bet you're hard pressed, I'm hard pressed to think of the last product, like complex product I bought that was made in Canada. I mean, really? No. So it's very challenging for government to have oversight over finished goods that are imported. There are regulations, and importers are supposed to comply with regulations. However, supply chains are now so complicated that even, for example, a cosmetic formulator, that is the people that put the cosmetic together, they buy different specialty chemicals from somebody else and somebody else. So the cosmetic formulator may not know what's in their products. So supply chains are really complicated. For example, in our review and our analysis of cosmetics that we went and purchased in Toronto, we found that about it was around a half of products marketed as long-lasting, weatherproof, put it on for 24 hours, it won't go away. I don't know why you'd want to wear any cosmetic for 24 hours, but anyways, I'm old. Anyways, all that stuff, long lasting, were about half of those had the forever chemicals PFAS in them. And they weren't labeled. I suspect, though, it wasn't because the cosmetic producers are nefarious and awful. I don't think they even knew that they were buying chemical ingredients that contain PFAS because of the complexity of the products. So what we can't do is keep up with the complexity of imported products, keep up with the number of new chemicals that are produced in terms of screening for their hazard and for their risk. I won't get into some of the other complexities. Suffice it to say that chemicals management in Canada cannot keep up with the increased complexity of the chemicals and product landscape. So I find that pretty frustrating. Do you want me to say more?
I'm a little scared.
Well, I just stay away from all that long-lasting makeup.
Yeah, so I have a
And you know
plethora
what?
of makeup.
And we did a study in nail salons, for example, because we're concerned about the exposure of the nail salon workers, not the people who go into nail salons, because their exposures are brief, but it's the workers and the workers who bring their kids in, right? Because there are lots of low-income, racialized people who work in nail salons, and their kids come into the nail salon after school. So we found elevated levels of actually, we were quite surprised with what we found. But here's a good thing that we found. We didn't find one of the chemicals that's on the Canadian cosmetics hot list. Yeah, so that works. That's great. The Canadian, at least for those chemicals on the hot list. Well, this one chemical, we didn't find it. So should you be scared? Well, you can see I don't color my hair. You can see that, or wear makeup, because I know that hair color contains nasty chemicals in order to color your hair. Like, it just doesn't work unless the chemicals are very harsh. We know that women in nail salons who apply, not women, hairstylists that apply hair color have higher incidence of cancer. They are nasty chemicals. And it's not going to be a matter of having great, safe hair color, because it doesn't work. You don't get those wild colors. So it's a matter also, not just of being scared, it's a matter of changing your expectations. It's a matter of changing what products you use, how often you purchase them, and changing the expectations of what beauty and fashion are. And don't even get me started on fast fashion, because I'll never end there.
It's terrible. This is so bad for the environment. That's okay. No, I've been trying to move towards like cleaner beauty, more vegan style products, but it definitely worries me when you're saying that some of these companies don't even really know what's in their formulas, because if I'm looking at a label and I don't see the bad product or like the bad ingredient there, and they're not listing it there, how do I know?
Well, you don't. You don't know necessarily. And I don't know what I don't know what a vegan product means anyways. So that's, there's a lot of greenwashing going on. Tremendous amount of greenwashing. And what I do is just use products that are that have few ingredients, that aren't fancy, and I try to minimize my use of products. And you know what? It has multiple benefits. It's not just for me, and it's not just when my kids were growing up, because Cassie, yes, I'm a mom too, and I was very cautious, very concerned about my kids, but I'm concerned about the workers. I'm concerned about the workers who produce these chemicals in chemical factories, largely overseas, with minimal provisions for their health protection. So when I use a product, I am concerned not only about me, because it's not all about me. I'm concerned about the people at the other end of the product line and who are handling the waste.
Those are powerful words. It's a lot to think about, but
it's my challenge to you.
No, I'm definitely gonna have to open my eyes and just really cut down on what I wear on my face. But Muhannad, I have a question for you. Going in this same kind of, I guess, line of questioning with transparency, really. Why do you think the industry is so opposed to transparency when it comes to disclosing all ingredients in beauty and personal care products? And why is it that major brands and their lobby groups in Canada are continuing to reject reforms to labeling when we're seeing their counterparts in the US supporting policies that enable full disclosure of ingredients?
Great question. Maybe before I get into answering that specific question, there's a thread that I want to pick up on from something that Miriam said around the industry's responsibility. I mean, I totally agree that industry needs to take responsibility. That's ultimately what government laws need to be doing, right? It's holding industry accountable. But we know industry doesn't move alone. Industry only moves when there is pressure on their bottom line, their profits, or when government tells them you need to do this or you have to do this, otherwise there will be some sort of consequence, usually fines or something that would impact them legally. And one of the most troubling things I think that has happened, perhaps maybe unintentionally, but I also think the industry, the chemical industry, had a big role to play in, is this chemical management kind of framework that we have. It's basically now become a regulatory system that's so overwhelming for government. But essentially what it does is it enables the chemical industry to produce and make new chemicals every day and put them into products, put them into anything, literally, and sell those products without having to first prove that those chemicals are safe. We don't really see that in the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry has its own issues. We won't go there, but at least there are some clear processes where if you want to create a pharmaceutical product, you have to show that it's safe. And pesticides, again, there's some deeply troubling regulatory issues there, but with pesticides, same thing. The industry needs to show some level of like, here's some data to show that this product, works and it's, safe. Again, there are flaws and deep flaws in the system, but with regular chemicals that are used in consumer products and cosmetics and beauty products, there's no, that onus on the industry to first prove and show that something is not going to be harmful to people doesn't exist. It's the onus is on a government to constantly, test and assess chemicals for risk for the health and the environment. And so we're always playing catch up, right? Because right now we have something like over 300,000 different chemicals that are registered worldwide. And with how we've kind of transformed, with how capitalism transformed the way we shop, which is you order everything online now, you don't know where things are made, where things are coming from. And there's also the stigma that if something is made in China, then it's worse than something that's made in the US or in Canada, but ultimately these chemicals are everywhere. So it's not about where it's made, it's about the fact that we don't have a strong regulatory system that ensures that toxic chemicals aren't added into products, and that needs to change. The transparency piece is really important, and that's kind of going back to your question, because I've always believed, and we've seen evidence of this, that when you give people information, whether that's the consumer or the worker or the scientist or the advocate, you're giving them power, right? If you don't know what you're being exposed to, you won't know what you need to fight for in terms of change. So labeling is so important for beauty products because, one, people need to know when they're shopping, when they're making their own individual choices, what they should be looking out for in terms of things to avoid. But as we're kind of discussing, it shouldn't be on the consumer. So what labeling does is that it kind of forces companies to take steps to take out chemicals that are toxic from their products, because no company wants to see a headline the next day on CTV or on the Globe and Mail to say that these chemicals have been found in these products and these chemicals are linked to cancer or hormone disruption. So once you provide that information to the public, then you can start to advocate for change because you have the information that you need. And that information is also important for the government, because now the government, there are some very well-intentioned scientists and people who work in government who are trying to do their best, but again, they don't have access to the data. The lack of data and the lack of labeling regulations is become so problematic, because what we're seeing now is that from an equity perspective, companies that are labeling their products and disclosing all of their ingredients tend to be more expensive, tend to be sold in, natural health food stores where, everything is a lot more expensive. And then what that means is that, people who don't have the economic means, people with less money, aren't able to shop their way out of their problem. So it's creating this inequity where, someone who has the ability to buy a more expensive product that might be free of some toxic chemicals can do so, but then everyone else is left behind. And that's, we know that when you test products from a dollar store, or when you test products that are marketed to gender marginalized groups or racially marginalized groups, we've seen a lot of data to show that these products contain higher levels of toxic chemicals, or a greater number of toxic chemicals. So that's really where labeling comes in, because it helps to create, to level the playing field a little bit, right? It kind of helps to tilt that balance away from the industry and more towards the public. Because without that information, it becomes very hard for us to know what needs to be changed. And just to kind of give you an example, like the PFAS chemicals, those are forever chemicals that are used in, products that are water resistant. So makeup that is water resistant might have PFAS, but also it's used in Teflon, right? And like nonstick pots and pans. We now have, I think, over 10,000 PFAS chemicals in the market, and like the regulators around the world don't even know what they are, what their identity is, what their names are. We just know that they exist. So that's why labeling is important in my perspective, and why we need to see stronger Canadian government action.
Oh my gosh. It's almost like we have to know in order to have the power to I don't know, just to push back, really. Jeez. Knowledge really is power with these sorts of things. And the more I learn, I'm like, I don't want to eat or touch or do anything. I just want to sit in my bubble, grow my own food, take all of this off. Wild. But Cassie, I've got a question for you. What are the opportunities for people to get involved in protecting our health and making our communities safer from these types of exposures?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, there's so many smart, excellent advocates on the line here on our panel as participants, who are doing the work every day to push industry to do the right thing and push government to enforce the laws and strengthen them. And I think that is, we see in the States that there has been a really rapid movement on environmental justice and addressing, even bringing forward, the Better Beauty Bill package, I think is the name of it, for excellent approaches, policy approaches to addressing the types of exposures that Marion was lifting up in terms of salon workers, talking about disclosure, talking about, addressing these problems in a much more direct way than the way that we do it now, which is trying to do these substances, individual chemical substances, and again, the time and the energy it takes to get a single substance regulated, as opposed to having an approach that really puts people first. And I think that we should never forget the power of our individuals' experience and story, telling the story of, if you are racialized and you are you're paid less, and yet you're being asked to, both buy more expensive clean products, but you're also being asked to maintain like a very expensive professional look that requires a lot of energy, a lot of time. And I think that, changing those standards as an individual, is not easy. And I think that that's where, this is a story that we need to put in front of the people who we've elected, who are supposed to be working in our interest. So I think that taking these stories to the people who are, in kind of various levels of government, this is the moment for us to be able to say, particularly these moments when we're hearing about Miriam talking about, the range of impacts, the range of risks that we're being exposed to. When Muhannad's talking about, chemicals that aren't even being characterized and yet are being released into the market before they're tested for safety. I think that that's, tying those issues together of, I'm trying to do my part, what are you doing? And I think that is, and I think saying that and asking about, not only what are you doing, but I will be back and I will be asking what you did, and I will bring a friend. And, we're not just here to send off a single email. We are part of a movement of people who are demanding that these products be safer. We're part of a movement of people who care deeply about equity and justice. And I think that is, that's the difference between, kind of the stuff we do to try and protect ourselves versus the stuff that we do to protect our communities and protect one another, and those who are most impacted by their work or by the types of products that they have access to. I think that we work in our own interest, but we also can demonstrate that this is not an issue that's going to go away, and that we are here in the long term to make sure that they do what they say they're going to do, from an election through to a policy decision. So I think that's, we do have great models in this moment coming from our, US partners, from the EU. We have people like Miriam who are doing great research on what is an essential use, what is an essential substance, what do we actually need to kind of live in this world and have, obviously we can't, buy nothing, but what is essential? And I think that these are really important questions being put to the government, and that's what we're trying to do, by using the media to make sure people understand that there are moments that they can push at any time, but these are particular moments when federal legislation is being considered, that when elected officials hear from you, they know that this is a serious problem, because people don't really pick up the phone and talk to MPs about, what's in their products all the time. And you'd be surprised what a few phone calls and maybe a meeting with a couple friends could turn into when it comes to people sweating in the background and saying that they will, yes, definitely find out more and come back. And I think that is exactly what they should be doing. And that is why they should be in office, because they're there to hopefully make our lives safer and greener and all the things that they like to say when they're on the campaign trail. But this is the time that you actually get to hold them to account. So there we go.
It's so true. I always hear that we should be calling our MPs, but I don't know anybody who actually does it. But the number's there and it's public. That's what it's there for. But that's okay. Now we are running just a little bit short on time, but it's okay. It's okay. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just say, Josie and anyone else on the call, anyone who ever wants to call their MP, I will sit there with you and we will talk to them about this problem and what we're going to do about it. So I'll drop my email in the chat, and everyone is welcome to take me up on the offer. And I am always happy to meet with your MP to talk about these issues, because it's my job, but it's also, my hobby apparently. So, let's do it. We can tell everybody how, you've done it the first time, and after that it gets so much easier. So there you are.
That's true. Having someone in solidarity sometimes is just enough to give you that extra little push to do it. So we might go over by just maybe about 5 minutes or so, but I've got another question for you guys here. So we'll start back up with Miriam. How can your work inform future change-oriented action?
So how can my work, or how can, oh yeah, okay. So we do very practical research, as I mentioned, and we've done work on, for example, looking at PFAS in cosmetics and kids products and food packaging. We're now working on PFAS in construction and building materials. And that's a way, I mean, that's essentially a name and shame approach. I'm very happy to share this with Muhannad and with Cassie and my other colleagues and NGOs who animate the work. I provide the research. My colleagues Muhannad and Cassie animate it, bring it to the public attention, which hopefully then causes the levers in government and in the private sector to respond. The fastest response, and I totally hear you, Muhannad, about and Cassie, about a government responsibility. But right now, what we're seeing is the fastest response by retailers who just are so much faster, unfortunately, than government. Some of these retailers are not my favorite, but Walmart, for example, is pulling, a bunch of toxic chemicals from products on their shelves. Hanes Footwear is no longer using PFAS. Patagonia is working to get rid of PFAS, if you can afford Patagonia. But anyways, there are a number of retailers that respond very quickly. So anyways, the point is, we do the research, not just myself, we do the research, myself and colleagues, bring it to the fore, allow you guys to take it out into the public, and that causes change. But the other thing that I'm doing is I'm involved in chemicals management. I have been involved in chemicals management at the provincial and the federal scales. And now I'm involved in chemicals management at the global scale. I was in Bangkok recently for the first face-to-face meeting of a new intergovernmental panel that's being set up on chemicals, waste, and pollution. That panel will be something similar, we hope, to like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But this is dedicated to chemicals, waste, and pollution. Once again, we work in an ecosystem where that ecosystem is doing fundamental, well, it's not fundamental, is doing very applied research, working with non-governmental organizations such as Ecojustice, such as Environmental Defense, Canadian Environmental Law Association, and also at the international scale. And we work together to bring this about. I'm going to be optimistic that this new intergovernmental international panel will raise the profile of chemical pollution, especially for countries in the global south. So we have vulnerable populations in Canada that we need to focus on, and we also have vulnerable countries, unfortunately, low-income countries that are sites of chemical production, chemical dumping, that don't have the capacity to protect individuals and their ecosystems. So I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to keep fighting. I'm just going to keep on being energetic about this. And that's what I'm doing.
Loving that you're fighting a good fight, but it sounds like your work is very foundational. You're right at the core. Everything kind of just stems from what you do. So what about you, Muhannad? How does your work inform future change-oriented action? We see how Miss Miriam here is the foundation. Where are you?
So one thing that we're working on right now, that we've been working on for over a decade, is the reform of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is basically, I would argue, is the most important environmental law in Canada. And it hasn't really been updated since 1999. So over 20, almost 24 years now. And the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which the acronym is CEPA, it's basically how the government regulates chemicals, right? It's the law that gives the government the power to be able to study and assess chemicals that are of risk and to regulate them. And right now there's a bill, and I think Cassie will probably speak to it a little bit more, that is almost near the finish line. This bill will amend and overhaul the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and will include for the first time in Canada a the first time we see the right to a healthy environment in a legislation. And that's really important because unlike 150 different countries around the world, we do not have such a right in a legislation, in a law, which is probably surprising for a lot of people. But what that means is that basically, if your right to a healthy environment is violated, then you can take action and hold the government to account for making sure that that right is not violated. And that could be through, for example, being exposed to a toxic chemical that should be regulated. And it also includes stronger controls and regulations of chemicals that are high risk, like cancer-causing chemicals. And for the first time, we want, this bill, when it passes, and hopefully it will pass in the next few weeks, it will ensure that, chemicals that are, that we know we have a lot of data to show that they are causing health issues or are contributing to the rise of chronic illnesses, will need to be prohibited and banned. And then there's also some amendments related to labeling, which are right now not very popular, and we need to continue to push to make sure that those amendments are adopted. But basically, and I'll let Cassie speak a bit more about this right now, but what we do is basically kind of push government, educate government and MPs about what's the right thing, what are the, what's a strong regulatory reform that we need to see. But ultimately, those members of parliament won't act unless, people are contacting them and telling them, I support you, I want you to do this. So, and that's where I'll hand it off to Cassie to speak a little bit more about, how that could work.
For sure. Thank you. This is a great lead-in. Cassie, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. And I think really wrapping in all of these points, knowing what's in your products is the floor of this issue. Just having basic information, we shouldn't have to fight industry to get information about what is in products. And they should be, although all the issues that Miriam raised in terms of the supply chain and contaminants and all kinds of issues that come up, they should be testing, they should know, and so should we. And in other jurisdictions, they do know. They are required to report a lot more information. They're required to be much more transparent. So that's where, we know they're complying in other jurisdictions. So why not in Canada? Why not us? So, I would say that industry does not like this issue of transparency. They do not want to be held accountable. They don't want to reformulate their products because it's expensive. They like to have the cheapest, easiest solution to this issue. But again, as Miriam said, there are retailers who are pushing them to disclose, and there are customers who are pushing them to disclose. Now we need the government to push them to disclose. And I think this is, the building up that pressure, it really does take people. They do read the paper, they do read their email, and they listen when things start to get loud. And so I would say that the more that you practice using your own voice and doing it imperfectly without being a chemistry prof or a professional law reform expert or whatever it is that I am, an activist, I think that really it doesn't take that seat to be able to push for change. We only get to do what we get to do because people care about this. So that's why we invite you at any time to start with signing a petition. Nothing wrong with that. But I think that if this issue has you thinking, as Josie said, rather than going and growing your own food, maybe instead let's all push on the system so that it's not all about what we can do in our own little sphere. It's actually about, back to Muhannad's point, the people who are profiting off of this toxic and, really inequitable industry of, hazardous beauty products and the ingredients that go into them. So I would say that's where I would land. And please do look, Ecojustice, environmental defense, our colleagues at CAPE and CANE and Breast Cancer Action Quebec, we all have opportunities to act on this Bill S5 that Muhannad was discussing, to push on changes to CEPA. And you can start with something as easy as just adding your name to a petition, and maybe that start your journey into, feeling more and more comfortable to speak up on these issues, because we shouldn't be alone in dealing with them. We should see results because these people work for us. So there we go.
Very well said, Cassie. Thank you so much to everybody. So there are some really good links for you guys in the chat in terms of some education pieces. Cassie's got her email in there in case you want to contact your MP and have her by your side. We also have a survey that's going to be dropped in there that you can put your opinions about the webinar if you so wish. And yeah, this concludes our third webinar in the series, The Environmental Injustice of Beauty. Thank you to our wonderful panelist speakers. You guys were amazing. We really appreciate your time. It was so valuable, as well as your insights. And to everybody else who's just joining us for this very important conversation. Thank you so much to Jack and the Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment, also known as CANE, for their amazing work putting together the technology for this webinar, because the back end is super complicated. And lastly, thank you so much to Ingrid for bringing us all together on this very important project. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Josie.
This was really great.
If you want to stay on for one more minute, I can answer the questions in the Q&A.
Oh, great. Oh, Janet Noodleman. Well, there we go. Another.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer Janet Noodleman's, but EWG, Environmental Working Group in the States, has a very good compilation of products such as cosmetics with their ingredients. Just note that, for example, some of the cosmetics that we sampled that had PFAS were not found by EWG because they weren't listed on the ingredients list. They run off of ingredients lists. But I really do support EWG. It's a great source of information. There's also Green Science Policy Institute that has a list of products, for example, PFAS-free products. Should you throw out your frying pan? No, well, I'm not sure, but a greater source of exposure to PFAS is actually not your frying pan, but it's going to be your Gore-Tex garments, your DWR, your dirt, rain and water resistant garments. For those of you who wear glasses and have sprays that has a quite high PFAS levels, it's actually just spray in your glasses. So I know, like, who knew? There are different types of PFAS. The ones we're most concerned with in terms of exposure are not actually the Teflon type of PFAS, but it's the applications that, for example, on textiles, on surfaces. And that's, I'm done.
And I just threw in one of my favorite things that people are doing is rounding up Black-owned beauty brands and the non-toxic products that are coming out of these excellent approaches to taking back the buying power and the health of communities. So I love this. I will say any list that anyone's pulling together of excellent Black beauty products that are non-toxic is such a great example of, and Campaign for Safe Cosmetics doing good work to for that kind of roundup. So if we're looking for places to buy, and there are also portals, you know, if you're looking for places, you know, there are retailers who really take this seriously, and some are very fancy and expensive, and some of them, as Marion mentioned, are like a Walmart who, you know, is actually doing the work of transforming the markets, which is actually, it's quite significant what they, when they say, you know, that a substance can no longer be in their products, they enforce it and they test the products. So I would say that's the retailer work is also kind of an interesting piece. So never hesitate. In addition to talking to your MPs, you can also, you know, push on places that you support and ask them what they're doing to not only get the toxics out of their products, but to support Black beauty and the people who are actually trying to transform this market. So there we go. And we have the gift. Thank you, Janet, for jumping into the chat. I think that is, you know, people, as I've mentioned, amazing advocates who are here as part of this work, Breast Cancer Prevention Partnership in the States. So thank you for joining and jumping in.